A very disturbing thing took place not very long in our country. A group of young boys on a school bus beat up another boy. They beat him up, they injured him, they hurt him very, very badly. I don't know what kind of home life or church life or anything like that any of these young people have. But I do know this. The actions of these three young boys resulted from an attitude that they had. I'm not sure about what an attitude toward exactly what, and I'm not sure what that attitude might have involved. But I do know this, that the decisions that we make in life and the actions that we take in life stem from our attitudes. I remember for myself, when I was just a little boy, I just really did not like to study. I didn't like school. I wanted to play. I wanted to go out and fly my kite. I wanted to ride my bicycle. I wanted to do something other than study. As a matter of fact, almost anything other than study. It was this way all the way through high school. Yes, I passed my grades. I always anticipated the time when the report cards would come up and what excuses I could have for maybe a failing grade. Well, I got by. Later during the war, I went into the Burch Marine, and I attended in part the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy. There's so many guys up there because this was supposed to be a bunch of smart people. There were so many men up there, young men who were at the academy together. They knew so many things that I didn't know. And I always felt like, why don't I know that? And then, the light turned on and said, you don't know that because of your attitude toward school in the early days. You wanted to do anything except study. Well, my mom and dad, don't you have homework for tonight? Yeah, it was just this arithmetic, that's all. Because if it was reading homework, I didn't like to read. I'm still a very poor reader. But I didn't like to read, so I just didn't read, The history assignments, I just didn't do them. Consequently, I didn't learn very much history except what went on in the class. And then later on, when people talked about historical events, I thought, boy, I wish I knew that. Why didn't I know that? Attitude. And my attitude finally underwent some changes. But I still feel the consequences of those attitudes that I had and how deprived I turned out to be in my own personal knowledge because of the attitude that I had toward school. Well, the Bible has a lot to say about this. It talks about it indirectly, sometimes directly. It talks about it indirectly very, very frequently. As a man thinks within himself, so is he. That's an attitude. How do you think? What do you think about? Bicycle riding, playing ball, flying my kite. That's what I thought about. And that's what I became. And then later had to change. These young boys who were caught in this terrible affair of beating this little boy up, hopefully their attitudes will change. Something needs to be done that helps to change people's attitude. Behavior is easy to change. You can teach a monkey to do a lot of things, to behave in certain ways. You can't teach his attitude very well, though. And attitude is what forms the basis of our decision. So I want us to look today at two men in the Old Testament. And I want us to just kind of probe this a little bit. The Bible doesn't say very much about their attitudes. It says a lot about their decisions and a lot about their consequences. But it doesn't say much about their attitude. So I want us to kind of try to pry this apart a little bit and see if we can come to any conclusion about the attitude of these men. The first one is one of my favorite in the Old Testament and many others, Abraham. Abraham had a wonderful attitude. The Lord said, Abraham, 12th chapter of Genesis, get out of your father's house. Go away from your country. Go away from your kindred. Go to a land that I will show you. And then he says, I'll bless you, I'll care for you, and so forth. I'll make your name great. You will be a blessing. I'll bless those who bless you, and I'll curse those who curse you. And then he says, in you shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Okay, what was Abraham's attitude? Well, we really find something out about this in the 11th chapter of Hebrews, where the writer of Hebrews said, by faith Abraham, when he was called, obeyed. He went out. And then he says this, he did not know where he was going. Oh, I tell you, I don't like that at all. When I get in the car and get ready to go somewhere, I want to know where I'm going. I don't like to be with people who don't know where they're going. It's so important to know where you're going. Abraham didn't know where he was going. God just says, get out. Go to a land that I'll show you. Okay, I'm Abraham now. I'm not going to move until you tell me where I'm going. I don't make it a practice just to get out and wander. I want to know where you're going to take me, where you want me to go. If you don't tell me that, I'm not going to go. Or he might have, I might have said, I've got my family here. That is, my brothers, my father, the extended family, they're all right here in Haran. And now you want me to leave them, and you don't even tell me where I'm going. Whatever you have in mind for me, why can't we do it right here? Give me a reason. Tell me why we can't do it right here. No. I guess Abraham maybe could have said this too. God, I'm an old man. I'm 75 years old. I don't think I'm very old. I'm 75 years old. I can't just get up and go someplace and not know anything about what's going on. No, that's not the attitude that Abraham had. Abraham is referred to later as the father of the faithful. The father of the faithful. He's referred to as a friend of God. Now, Abraham had absolute trust in God. So when God said, move, Abraham says, I'll move. When God said, go, Abraham says, I'll go. Abraham didn't stop to question God. Why? Because his attitude toward God was one of complete trust. That's really hard for me. I think that's probably hard for all of us. It's a little bit like J.P. Sanders said in a talk at chapel in David Lipscomb College one time. He says, have you ever read that 13th chapter of 1 Corinthians? In that chapter, Paul says, love never fails. I say, love never fails most of the time. Part of the time. However, in this situation, I have ways of getting around that, you see. And so, sometimes when it comes to this thing of trusting God, we're pretty much in the same situation where, yes, but God, here's the time I've got to take it into my own hand. I've got to do it the way I want to do it. Now, I know it might not be exactly right, but you don't understand. This is the situation I'm in. And so much of the time, we just, I trust, faith, yes, that's good to a point. No, Abraham said that's good all the way up and down. Now, Abraham trusted God. And so Abraham is used throughout the Old Testament and throughout the New Testament as a man of deep, abiding faith. Why? His attitude toward God was one of trust. One of trust. And so, when we read about the life of Abraham, we find that Abraham made decisions that drew him closer to God. Abraham accepted the consequences of his decisions. And his decisions to go with God, his decisions to obey God, turn out to have wonderful consequences. Oh, wait a minute, that's not always true, is it? No, that's not always true. You see, Jesus had a great attitude toward God. And they crucified him. They tortured him. Things didn't work out the way we would like to think that they worked out. If I'm a good Christian, if I trust God, if I obey God, why should I suffer? Well, the passage that Billy read for us just a moment before the Lord's Supper, very, very important here, because he was our example. He was the one who taught us what it really is to be with God, to do as God wants us to do. It comes from attitude. Now, I might not like the consequences of it. They might not suit me. And so sometimes people will say, well, I have lived right, I've done the right thing, and now look what happened to me. And so I'm going to throw God away. I talked to a man one time that I had baptized. I baptized him, baptized his wife. His wife got cancer a number of years later. I had already moved away from the place, but I came back, and this fellow's name was Bob. And Bob, why did you quit Christianity? And I mean, he completely quit it. He said, I cannot believe in a God who would allow that kind of suffering. Well, I can't say that I understood, because I think only somebody in that situation could understand. But the point is that when things don't suit us, when things, we've lived right, we've done right, we've tried in every way, and yet things are not turning out right, the consequences are not what we wanted. And yet we have to think of Paul and Peter and James and Jesus and the apostles, all of them except John, who died martyrs' deaths. You see, the whole consequence of my decisions is not all wrapped up in how things immediately turn out. When the Lord appeared to Paul, Saul of Tarsus, and then later to Ananias, the one who carried the gospel to him, Ananias said to the Lord, Lord, I know about this fellow. I've heard about him. He's been persecuting the church. And then the Lord said, I'm going to show him how many things he will have to suffer for my name's sake. You see, attitudes bring decisions. Decisions bring consequences, and sometimes those consequences are not exactly what we would like for them to be. So, where does this take us? It takes us to the idea of trust. It takes us to the idea that we must learn that God doesn't answer all of our prayers the way we want them answered. There are consequences to the things that we do. The second person I would like to talk about is David, man after God's own heart. Well, let's look at him. when he was just a young boy, out keeping sheep. The rest of the boys, the rest of the male offspring of Jesse, they were all there together. And, a king is to be selected out of someone who is the son of Jesse. And no, not this one, not this one, Samuel was told. And then Samuel says, is this all the sons you've got? That's all of them. Well, I've got this young boy. He's out keeping the sheep. Bring him. Well, he was the one. He was David. And he was anointed as a young boy. He was anointed as king, the king to come. Well, you know some of those stories, don't you? God said of this young man, he's a man after my own heart. I think that is just one of the finest descriptions you could ever imagine about what God thought of David. As a young boy, he was still not old enough to go to war, but his brothers were in the army, and his brothers were out at the war against the Philistines, and David was going to carry some supplies to them. He carried the supply down there, and while he was there, this great big giant came out, and he started hollering over to him, send somebody out here to fight me. It scared him to death. And David said, why didn't somebody go out and fight this man? And they scolded David, said, you don't understand. You're a kid. You don't understand this. David said, I'll go fight him. And, they took him to Saul, the king, and Saul said, well, here, take my armor. And David put this armor on. Saul was a big man, by the way. I don't know what size David was, but David says, I don't know how in the world to use this. So he took it off, and he crossed over a little brook and picked up 5 little stones. You know that story. Picked up 5 little stones, and here's this great big 8-foot giant out there, and he sees this little kid coming to him. He said, you think I'm a dog? You come to me with a slingshot or a sling? And then David said, you come to me with a sword. I'm coming to you in the name of the Lord that you have defiled. David trusted. That was his attitude. He picked up that stone, put it in the sling, and he slung it. You know the story. He hit him on the head, knocked him out, and then he took the sword of the giant and cut his head off. We know that story. What was working in David? His attitude. His attitude caused him to make a decision. And his decision had consequences. In that case, the complete army of Israel went out and defeated the Philistines. Wow, what a great thing that was. Women came out singing and celebrating, and they said, oh, Saul has killed thousands. David has killed tens of thousands. Uh-oh. That's bad. Saul said, wait a minute. They've attributed thousands to me, but 10,000s to David. Saul didn't like that. Saul tried about 3 times to kill David. He was unsuccessful every time. David had great respect for Saul because Saul was God's anointed. Saul finally was killed in a battle. David received this news from a fellow who thought he thought he'd get a reward. But instead, David was so sorry. He was so sorry at the fate of Saul because Saul was God's anointed. And so there's a great lament that he writes in the first chapter of 2 Samuel, a great lament that he writes there about Saul, how he has fallen now, because he had great respect for him. A man after God's own heart. Isn't that just a wonderful thing? Then David became king. Well, David had been chased all over the place, down in the southern part of the country, and finally now he'd been made king. Oh wow, this is just really great. The women have been singing songs of praise about what he did with Goliath, and now everybody knows David, and David is really the thing. David recaptures the city of Jerusalem. You see, Jerusalem was conquered during the invasion under Joshua. Jerusalem was conquered, but then apparently it went back to the Jebusites because David had to go in and conquer it again. He made it his capital city. He defeated the Philistines, and we don't find very much trouble out of the Philistines after this. He brought the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. God even promised David, it will be through you, through your descendants, that the Messiah will come. He gained great victory. Under David, Israel's borders expanded to the very nth degree. The greatest territory that Israel owned at that time was through the conquest of David. I think one of the really interesting things, after all of these things, David asked one of his servants, he said, is there anybody in Saul's household, they came and tried to kill him, anybody in Saul's household that I can show mercy to? And they said, well, Saul had a son named Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth he's crippled. David said, bring him to me. They brought him. David said, Mephibosheth, for the rest of your life, I'm going to provide for you. Provide for your needs. You will eat at my table. I will care for you. Wasn't that a wonderful thing? All kind of good things were going on, and David is popular. Well, somewhere along the line, a terrible, terrible thing happened to David. Because in the 5th chapter in the 10th chapter of 2 Samuel, we read about the fact that David now commits adultery with the wife of one of his soldiers while the army was out fighting. This soldier was he was a mercenary named Uriah. He was a Hittite. And then it was discovered that, she's pregnant. Well, today they would say that was a mistake. It was a mistake for David to do that. It was an indiscretion for David to do that. No, the Bible calls this sin. The Bible says it's terrible. It's not something that we just kind of get by with and then we brush it aside. So the way the whole thing turned out was that to cover himself, David then had to commit murder. David had to have Uriah the Hittite deserted in a battle so that Uriah would get killed. And when the news came that Uriah the Hittite had been killed, David kind of brushed it off. The sword kills one and then it kills another. We don't have any control over this, when David had really planned it all himself. What was taking place here? For some reason, David's attitude toward the law, David's attitude toward God, David's attitude toward other people had changed. That meant that his decisions had changed. Well, what caused him to change? I don't know. But as you stop and think about this whole story, you can kind of come to a conclusion or two. For example, I'm now a man of power. Saul was chasing me all over creation. Now I'm the one in power. The king who expanded the borders of Israel. Prestige. All kings, I guess, have prestige. You know, people bow and scrape to them, and people address them very respectfully and all this sort of thing. I'm up here. They're down there. Well, another thing that probably changed his attitude was, you know, as king, I've got a lot of stuff to do. I'm really busy. I'm taking care of all kinds of things that I didn't have to take care of before. So God gradually gets crowded out of his life. No, not completely, but God's now in second place, maybe third place. Well, David became a wealthy man. Kings are wealthy. David became a wealthy man. Nothing is denied of the king. You just don't withhold things from the king. And I don't know, but I just have an idea that David became kind of proud and arrogant. Kind of proud and arrogant. Why? Well, I've got power, I've got prestige. When I say jump, everybody says, well, how high you want me to jump? And, you know, all of this sort of thing. And so David now sees a beautiful woman. And she's over there on her housetop and she's bathing. And David says, that's for me. He sent for her, committed adultery with her. And then you know the rest of that story. Well, a lot of things were taking place there. I wonder if David saw himself drifting away. I remember being on a river one time fishing, and we stopped the motor and we started casting and trying to attract a fish, and we were just paying attention to our fishing. And then all of a sudden we turned around and looked. We were nowhere near where we started. It all happened unknown to us. You see, Satan doesn't tell us how bad something is. He tells us how much fun it is, how good it is, how it's perfectly okay, how everybody does it, how you can get away with it, how you're up here and they're down there, and so forth and so forth. And so when David committed adultery, when David had Uriah killed, Nathan the prophet came to him and he said, David, I got a story to tell you. And he told him a story about a rich man who stole the little lamb of a poor man because they had a traveler coming, and he chopped this little lamb up and gave that to his traveler. Well, David said, a man like that ought to be killed. We'd say we shoot him. And then Nathan said, David, let me tell you something. You're that man. This is what the Lord says. Out of your own household, I'm going to bring calamity upon you. Before your very eyes, I will take your wives and give them to one who is close to you. He will lie with your wives in broad daylight. You did it in secret, but I will do this thing in broad daylight. And then David said to Nathan, says, I've sinned against the Lord. And Nathan said, the Lord has put away your sin. You will not die. Nevertheless, because of this deed, you have utterly scorned the Lord. The child that is born to you shall die. And then he said, the sword will not depart from your house. Maybe it's like Hosea said. He said, the people sow to the wind, and they reap the whirlwind. Whatever a man sows, that shall he also reap. Oh, there are unanticipated consequences. Listen to what happened. The child that was born of that adulterous relationship, that child died. David had a son by the name of Amnon, and his son raped his half-sister. David's son Absalom killed his half-brother Amnon. Absalom later led an insurrection against his own father and took over his father's kingdom. Later, Absalom was killed in the battle to regain Jerusalem. No sooner had David reestablished his kingdom than there was another rebellion from someone named Sheba. Again, the Philistines rose up and fought against him. And then just prior to David's death, another of his sons, Adonijah, tried to usurp the throne from his brother. Wow. Wow. Attitudes cause us to make decisions, and we have to suffer the consequences. Folks, I don't know what your attitude might be toward Christ, toward the gospel. Whatever your attitude might be toward these things, stop and think. Am I willing to pray, God, help me to face myself and see myself as you see me? Maybe I'm drifting away. Maybe there was a time when I was very, very faithful to the Lord in oh so many ways, and now I'm drifting away. My devotion is not what it should be. It's not what it used to be. Oh, I'm not a bad person, but my devotion to God has been crowded out by some of the same things that David spoke of. Maybe it's my job. Maybe it's my family. Maybe it's because I've gained some prestige, and maybe it's because of my position. Whatever it might be, what is reducing my devotion to the Lord? You see, attitudes bring decisions. Decisions bring consequences. Follow the steps of Abraham, who is faithful all the way through his life. Don't follow the steps of David when he rejected the Lord and began going his own way. Oh yes, God forgave him. God forgave him. But David had the consequences that he had to suffer. If you're not a Christian today, this is a great time to become a child of God, to pledge your allegiance to God in being baptized into Him, to pledge your allegiance to God in promising to live the Christian life. Pledge your allegiance to God in executing that devotion to God that you know you need to perform. If you're in any way subject to the invitation of Christ, we're going to sing an invitation song, and we invite you to respond. Shall we stand, please?